I worked the night audit shift at a small hotel in central Minnesota. It wasn't a big place, only 53 rooms. The hotel was located just outside of downtown, tucked away on a quieter side street. The shift was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and as the only person on duty, it was a lot of solitary work. You didn't get many late-night check-ins. Usually, it was only 1 to 3 people at the most. Most of the time, I was alone in the hotel, with the quiet and darkness as my only company. The first task every night was to lock the doors, the front, back, and 2 side doors. As the night audit, I was responsible for making sure the place was secure for the night. Only guests could get in, using their key cards. It was a pretty standard procedure, nothing out of the ordinary. There was also a phone on the wall next to the front entrance, just in case someone showed up after the doors were locked or if anyone needed assistance with a late-night pizza delivery. It was a small town, and there wasn't much that ever happened around here, so things were usually pretty quiet. After I locked all the doors, I'd head into the back room behind the front desk to finish any laundry that wasn't completed during the day. There was no staff on overnight, so it was another duty of the night audit to handle anything left undone. There was a cordless phone I could take with me into the back room, in case someone called or I needed to be available at the front desk. I had no scheduled check-ins for the rest of the night, but there were still a couple of rooms available just in case. I was busy sorting through a load of laundry when I heard something. At first, it was faint, but it grew clearer, the sound of the front door trying to open. I figured someone had forgotten their key, or maybe someone just didn't realize the doors were locked at night. But when I didn't hear anything else, I thought they'd left, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then, a few moments later, the phone rang. It was strange, no one ever called this late. When I picked it up, I could hear someone breathing on the other end, but they didn't say anything right away. I walked up to the front desk, the phone still in my hand, and waited. The silence was unsettling. Finally, the person on the other end spoke. Their voice was low, almost casual, like they were telling a story. They said something about being a former cop, something about court in the morning, and then it got darker. They started talking about how if I didn't let them in, they were going to come inside and shoot me. They said they were circling the hotel, watching it. My blood ran cold. I glanced up from the phone and out the window that overlooked the front of the hotel. I had a clear view of the street from where I was standing, and there, across the street, I saw someone standing under the dim streetlights. They were looking right at me, holding a phone in their hand. Their gaze felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. I could barely breathe. I told them I was sorry, but we didn't have any rooms available. The words left my mouth before I could even think about it. They didn't let me finish. The person hung up on me before I could get another word out. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I walked quickly to the window and looked again. The person was still standing there. The phone was in their hand, their eyes locked on me from across the street. My heart was pounding, and I felt the overwhelming urge to lock all the doors again, just to make sure everything was secure. I didn't trust anything anymore. I hurried to check all the doors, double-checking the front, back, and side entrances. As I made my way around the hotel, I noticed something strange. One of the side doors, one of the 2 that was supposed to be locked, was propped open. A doorstop was wedged under the door, holding it ajar. My stomach churned. I quickly pushed the door shut and locked it, trying to steady my breath. I knew I had to stay alert, but I wasn't sure what to do. The hotel was small, and the rooms were so close to each other. Every window in the building was a potential way for someone to see inside. I couldn't help but feel that the person outside was still watching me, waiting for me to slip up. They had made it clear that they were willing to do something dangerous. The thought that they were out there, circling the hotel, made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I moved to the conference room, which had a clear view of the street where the person had been standing. I kept the lights off and peeked through the blinds. The street was empty now. The figure was gone. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified. They had been right there, watching me, and now they were gone. Where had they gone? Was I still being watched from somewhere else? The rest of the night dragged on. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, my nerves frayed by the thought of someone being so close to getting inside. I couldn't stop checking the doors. I couldn't stop peering through the windows, wondering if the person would reappear. It was as though I was trapped in the hotel with someone I couldn't see, but I knew they were out there. I kept the phone with me, just in case the person called again, but there were no more calls. Just silence. That silence only made the whole situation worse, though. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, felt like it was leading up to something terrible. By the time my shift finally ended at 7 a.m., I was exhausted. My mind was still racing, and the adrenaline that had kept me on edge all night seemed to drain out of me in an instant. I'd never been so happy to leave a job in my life. I didn't care that I had finished my shift. I didn't care that I had made it through the night. The fact that I had been threatened and that someone had actually been watching me, I couldn't shake the fear. It's been a long time since that night. I don't work at that hotel anymore, not because I don't need the job, but because the experience was just too much. I left because I couldn't handle the isolation anymore. The feeling of being alone and vulnerable in a building with so many windows. I'll never forget that night, though. The night I was threatened by someone who seemed to know exactly where I was, and the night that, for hours, I knew I was being watched. So, to the person who threatened to shoot me while I was working the night audit shift, let's not meet again. A little over a year ago, I worked the overnight shift at a gas station just a few blocks from my house. I know, working alone at that hour sounds like a terrible idea for a woman, but it was a slow store, and the sheriff's office was just across the street. That gave me a sense of security, maybe a false one, in hindsight. Most nights, I get no more than 30 customers during my entire 8-hour shift. It was quiet, almost boring. But at 3:30 a.m., on a night that should have been no different than the rest, something changed. I was outside, sweeping up the lot, checking the trash, and sneaking in a cigarette. I had one earbud in, music low enough to stay aware of my surroundings. That's when I noticed him. Across the road, in the dimly lit parking lot of the sheriff's office, a man stood with his back to me. He swayed back and forth, his head tilted downward like he was concentrating on something. At first, I thought he was just relieving himself against the sheriff's office, of all places, but something about him was off. His white t-shirt was ripped, and I recognized him from earlier in the night. He'd come in hours ago, reeking of alcohol and making my skin crawl. He was a creep then, and he was even more of one now. I looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice me. It was working, until a car pulled into the lot. The headlights swept across the pavement, illuminating his face as he turned to watch the vehicle. Then his eyes flicked to me. Back to the car. Back to me. I forced myself to ignore him and focused on the customer instead. As she left, I walked her to the door, still clutching my cigarette. We both heard him then, his voice rising in angry, slurred mutterings. He wasn't talking to anyone, just arguing with the air. "Be careful," the woman said, glancing at him warily. I made a joke, something about how he should be more afraid of me, but it felt hollow. By the time she drove off, he had moved closer to the road, now fully facing my store. His expression twisted into something unreadable, his mouth moving in frantic, unintelligible shouts. His eyes, wild and dark, were the kind that made my stomach knot. I'd worked graveyard shifts before. The ones with eyes like that, they were the ones to watch out for. I turned and walked inside, locking the door behind me. The second I was behind the counter, I typed up a quick, temporarily closed sign, just in case. As I rounded the counter to tape it up, my blood ran cold. He had crossed the street. I barely managed to lock the door before he stumbled into the parking lot, stopping just feet away. His eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I raised a hand to my neck in a cut-it-out motion and shook my head. "No, we're closed. Go away." For a moment, he just stood there, swaying, processing. Then he screamed something, loud, vicious. Not just anger, but rage. His arms flailed, his voice rising to a guttural roar. I felt my breath hitch. This wasn't normal drunk behavior. I needed to call the cops. I stepped away from the door, grabbed the phone with shaking hands, and dialed. The dispatcher's voice was calm, routine, but my heart was racing. I explained the situation as quickly as I could, and they assured me an officer would be there soon. I had just hung up when I heard it. Bang. The door rattled. Bang. Bang. He was pounding on the glass, yanking at the handle, trying to force his way in. Then he took a step back and ran at it. The glass held. I made the mistake of opening my mouth. "I called the cops, you psycho. Your ass is about to be grass." The second I said it, I knew I screwed up. His expression changed. His body stiffened. Then, just like that, he bolted. By the time the cops arrived, he was gone. They circled the area for an hour, searching the roads and nearby neighborhoods, but they found nothing. He was on foot. There weren't many places to go, and yet it was like he'd disappeared. I didn't file a report. What was the point? He hadn't hurt me, and without a name or a face beyond some drunk guy, there wasn't much they could do. Still, for the next 3 months, every night I worked, I watched the shadows. Every time I stepped outside, I checked every direction. I kept the doors locked as often as I could. I'll never know if I made the right choice that night. Maybe if I hadn't told him about the cops, they would have caught him. Maybe if I'd ignored him, he would have given up. Maybe he came back, and I just never saw him. All I know is, I don't work there anymore, and I never will again. The mall was massive, one of the largest in the state, and for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, it was my job to patrol it overnight as a security guard. At 6 feet 7 inches, I wasn't someone you'd mess with. I'd like to think I was intimidating, but even I couldn't have prepared for what happened that night. Most nights were just routine. By 9:30 p.m., we'd ushered out the last of the lingering customers, and by 11 p.m., the shops were dark and empty. The business owners were gone, the mall was deserted, and it was just me and a few other guards walking the perimeter, making sure no one had slipped inside to cause trouble. We weren't armed, not really. Just a can of mace, a radio, and a flashlight. That was all we needed. But not that night. It was around 2 a.m. I remember it like it was yesterday. The food court was the only place still dimly lit, with the soft glow from the skylight casting faint shadows over the rows of vacant tables. The vending machines hummed quietly, their motors low enough that you almost didn't notice them. It was eerie, in a way, but I'd grown used to the solitude. I just sat down to eat my sandwich when it happened. The noise. At first, it was so soft I thought I'd imagined it. A dull scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth, staring into the silence of the food court. There it was again, louder this time. Definitely not in my head. I set the sandwich down and grabbed my flashlight, stepping cautiously toward the sound. The scraping was coming from the hallway that led to the restrooms. It was slow at first, methodical, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. My heart rate quickened, but I kept moving, drawn to the source of the noise. As I approached, the scraping grew more deliberate, more urgent. I could feel it in my chest, the vibration of the sound. I stepped quietly, trying not to make any noise of my own. When I reached the restroom doors, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there for a moment, waiting, trying to listen. Then I heard it. Breathing. Low. Ragged. Male. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body screaming to turn and run, but I couldn't. This was my job. I had a responsibility to check it out. No one else would. I reached for the radio at my side. "This is 1 to 3. I need help at the food court restrooms," I said, my voice calm despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. But the radio crackled with static. No response. I tried again. Nothing. I glanced down at my radio, then back at the door. My stomach twisted. The radio was dead. I should have gotten an immediate response, either a guard or a dispatcher. But there was nothing. I gripped the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat, and pushed it open just a crack. The breathing stopped. A wave of cold air hit me as I peered inside. The room was silent. I took a breath and stepped inside. The stalls were empty. Their doors hung slightly ajar, just enough to make the place feel like something was off. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room. Everything appeared normal, too normal. I exhaled, a little less tense, but something was still wrong. The quiet in that restroom wasn't natural. That's when the door behind me creaked. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw him. A man, tall, broad, standing half in and half out of the restroom door. His matte gray hair clung to his forehead, and his skin was sallow, almost sickly under the harsh beam of my flashlight. But what really froze me in place was his face. He wasn't just standing there. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not even a menacing one. It was a guilty smile, like a child caught sneaking cookies. But it wasn't just any smile. It was as if he knew something I didn't. His eyes glinted, and then he raised one finger to his lips. My heart dropped into my stomach. My throat felt tight, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The silence in the room seemed to press against me, suffocating me. Then, in an instant, He flung the door open and bolted, moving with a speed that didn't make sense for someone who looked like him. He clutched something small and metallic in his hand. A box. I didn't hesitate. My legs moved before I could think, and I sprinted after him, the air burning in my lungs. But he was too fast. Far too fast. He darted into the shadowy hallway, disappearing into the dark corners of the mall. I staggered to a stop, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. What had just happened? I glanced back at the restroom, trying to make sense of it all. The sound, the breathing, his smile. What was he doing there? What was in that box? Why had he been waiting? I grabbed the radio again, my hand trembling. This is 1 to 3. I need backup. Something's happened. I think someone's inside. But when the radio crackled back to life, it was as if nothing had changed. The other guards returned my calls like everything was fine. They asked if I was okay, but didn't seem to understand the urgency in my voice. We did a full sweep of the mall, but there was no sign of him. No sign of forced entry. No broken doors. No traces of anything out of place. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The hours dragged on, and by the time my shift ended, I was ready to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had so many questions, but no answers. I stayed for another week, but that experience lingered in my mind, clawing at me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit. I still think about that man, that night, and what he was doing in the mall. The radio going dead, his smile, the box. I have no idea what was inside it, but I know one thing for sure. He was waiting, and I don't think he's gone. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the strange and unexpected. If you enjoyed the story, hit that like button, share with fellow curious minds, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Until next time, stay curious, stay intrigued,